You're watching HuffPost Live. I'm Ahmed Shahabuddin. And 2 years ago, when the Arab uprisings first began in Tunisia, the New York Times called it Al Jazeera's moment. Not just because of its bold and unparalleled coverage, but because it shaped the very narrative of popular revolt sweeping through the region. Al Jazeera is funded by and based in Qatar. When it launched in 1996, it provided an unprecedented platform for free speech in a region that desperately lacked it. Now, it continues to play a critical role in amplifying the voices of protesters, challenging their authoritarian and American-backed regimes. These regimes, of course, have for decades oppressed their own people, and Al Jazeera continues to frame the uprisings as part of a larger collective Arab struggle. But last Thursday, Qatar jailed a Qatari poet, or sentenced him for life, and many are asking why. The answer being because he wrote a poem celebrating the very uprisings Al Jazeera has been covering and Qatar has been supporting both financially and militarily. His sentencing has sparked outrage and charges of hypocrisy from human rights groups and journalists alike. And now joining me are some of those journalists. Amber Lyon, an investigative journalist coming to us from Morocco. Imran Garda, a former Al Jazeera journalist who hosted a show on the network, the English network, with yours truly, full disclosure. He joins me from Johannesburg, South Africa. Omar Chatriwala, a journalist at Doha News in Qatar. And Shireen Sadeghi, an Iranian-American journalist based in San Francisco. Omar, because you are in Qatar, why don't we start with you? Many people around the world are pointing to the blatant hypocrisy. How are Qataris reacting?
I don't think Qataris are reacting in such a way that they feel that it's necessarily hypocritical. Everybody that I've heard from here in Qatar seems to believe that he's going to be pardoned. So it's a temporary situation that he's been sentenced to life. And ultimately, they say he's not innocent. He did something wrong insofar as he was talking about the rulers of the country in a negative light.
Which is illegal, according to Qatari law. However, Omar, what's interesting is that he was already held in solitary confinement, and as his lawyer says, the whole trial was held in secrecy. He wasn't allowed to defend himself. His lawyer wasn't allowed to defend him. That doesn't disturb any in Qatar? People aren't paying attention to this?
Well, I think that there's actually a little bit of a dispute. The lawyer definitely says that there's a number of irregularities, and there's some international observers who say the same thing. But the prosecutor denies these irregularities, and since there's not a free flow of information here, the story isn't really one that's been covered in the papers. It's just kind of word of mouth. So I don't think a lot of people necessarily realize that there's this concept of the irregularities, and at the same time, people say, "Oh well, he's just making it up. It's a spin campaign, etc."
Imran, you heard what Omar has to say. You've worked in the region, you worked for Al Jazeera, you've reported from Qatar also on issues that otherwise aren't often reported, such as migrant rights and labor rights. What do you make of this news story and this sentencing of the poet for life? Do you think it'll affect Al Jazeera's reputation, let alone Qatar's?
Well, it would only affect Al Jazeera's reputation if Al Jazeera, A, doesn't cover it, or B, doesn't cover it properly, which, to the best of my knowledge, both seem to be happening right now, which is quite unfortunate because the channel does, in fact, sort of support this troika of freedom of speech, human rights, and democracy. And usually when the stories of the individual versus the state crop up, Al Jazeera does tend to back the underdog in this respect. With Qatar, unfortunately, this is not the case. As Omar says, and may I mention that I think it's great that Omar has Doha News, which is a new initiative, and I think it's really important. If you looked at Doha News' coverage of, for example, the Bellagio fire compared to Al Jazeera, Doha News was far superior because it's an organic media initiative coming from professional journalists, which is not state-funded. That aside, yes, I think this is unfortunate. It's sad that a guy, wrote a poem and that he's facing life in prison. He might be pardoned, which is a good thing. This might be embarrassing to the rulers, the Emir, Sheikh Hamoza, and everybody else who are the figureheads of this nation. And then they might pardon him. That wouldn't take away the problem, which is that there are fundamental structural problems in the country with regards to human rights, freedom of speech, and stuff within the country that are swept under the carpet. And you've got the dichotomy of a country and its media, Al Jazeera and otherwise, which promotes human rights, free speech, etc. elsewhere, and lives up to its billing, undoubtedly. It would be great for their own credibility if they covered this and covered it properly. 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, Sultan al-Khalifi, the blogger, was arrested. The sum total of Al Jazeera's coverage of that was a web piece, which at the bottom, and yeah, you've pulled it up there, great. Yes, the sum total of that was a web piece which quoted Amnesty, and at the bottom it said the Qatari government could not be contacted for comment. So essentially, we couldn't get in touch with ourselves to further the journalism in this story.
Right, of course, for those who aren't familiar, Imran's pointing to the fact that the Qatari government owns Al Jazeera, and so for them to say that they could not contact themselves certainly is confusing at best. Amber, I want to come to you because you've reported from other Gulf countries, namely Bahrain. You used to work at CNN. You created a documentary. You understand the challenges in reporting in this region. And the truth is, even Al Jazeera's own journalists were not allowed in Bahrain after they had released a documentary called Shouting in the Dark that perhaps wasn't favorable to the regime in Bahrain. What are your thoughts on how this might affect Qatar and Al Jazeera's reputation as a symbol of free speech?
Well, I think more and more Al Jazeera is starting to become more criticized for not participating in equal journalism. And by equal, I mean equally looking internally as well as externally when it comes to stories. Al Jazeera, journalistically, they do a terrific job. I mean, their reporters are out there covering some fantastic stories and exposing amazing investigations when it comes to human rights, the Arab Spring, environmental abuses. But then when it comes to actually looking at abuses that are happening in Qatar, we don't see an equal amount of coverage. And it's exactly what you're saying, Ahmed, about them saying that they couldn't get a hold of themselves because they are the government running the journalistic outlet. And if you look at the principles of journalism, our main goal is to be watchdogs on government. So it's you get into a strange situation. It's what we're seeing right now with Al Jazeera. When you have actual governments owning journalism, it's very difficult to be a watchdog on the entity that's providing your paycheck and bite the hand that feeds you.
Of course, and as much as in the West, Al Jazeera English has a reputation, the New York Times calling, the uprisings when they first began Al Jazeera's moment. There's also Al Jazeera Arabic, and the two channels really have very different editorial policies. Feel free to comment on that, but what that points to, I think, most importantly, is that Al Jazeera really operates kind of in an odd, kind of peculiar way because it's hailed as this beacon of free speech, but at the same time, many people point to the fact that it is inherently biased, and many media outlets are biased. Shireen, do you think Al Jazeera is biased? We have many people in our comment while saying it's biased, and do you think that it's a small price to pay, as some would say, for Al Jazeera not to report on injustices or not to support free speech in Qatar, so long as they're doing so much for the region?
Yeah, but it's not just in Qatar that they're doing this. It's also in Bahrain. They haven't been covering the Arab Spring uprising, as they're called, in Bahrain that started in February 2011. They don't cover anything to do with news items that might be negative, that refer to any of the royalty in the Persian Gulf countries. It's not just Bahrain that they're doing this to. And a lot of people might not remember, but when the Arab Spring first started in Tunisia, in the first few days after Bouazizi immolated himself, there was a lot of complaint and chatter on the Twitter sphere, on the internet, and amongst young Arabs and Arab journalists about how Al Jazeera is not covering Tunisia. They picked it up after all the complaints, but they didn't even want to cover the Arab Spring when it first started. So that's really, really important. Another issue that I wanted to bring up is that it's quite interesting with regard to the Qatari poet who has been detained for 1 year now. We need to remember that he has already been in solitary confinement for 1 year. It's interesting about him because in the Middle East, for millennia, poets have been criticizing royalty, and royalty has never liked it. But what's happened is they used to criticize the royalty indirectly. Ancient Persian poets like Rumi or Hafiz, if you look at their poetry, they are criticizing the elite. They're criticizing the royalty, but they're doing it indirectly. And that's why they lived to tell their tales. And what's happening with this Qatari poet and with other poets and creative people and expressors in the region is that they're not doing it indirectly anymore. And the king is figuring it out and he's reacting.
All right. Before we carry on, I actually want to hear from the Qatari Emir himself, who allegedly was, perhaps the victim, some would say, in terms of the poet criticizing the Emir, which is illegal under Qatari law. So why don't we actually play this? This is from CBS's 60 Minutes.
Actually, we don't have the influence. We are supporting the people of those countries who's asking for justice and dignity.
That's influence.
Okay, if this is influence, I think this is a healthy influence. I think all the world should support this.
So what about the justice of the poet? I mean, I know that's the obvious question, Imran. I'm gonna just ask you very simply, do you think that this poet is significant to the Qatari regime?
Oh, he is an absolute test case, and I think this is why it's terribly important. You asked the question earlier on, is it a small price to pay, not, focusing on Qatar? A, what happens within its boundaries, and B, what happens vis-a-vis its foreign policy. That might have been the case for a few years before Qatar became incredibly expansionist in its foreign policy, started becoming the kind of Don Corleone of the region. And now it is the indispensable player with regards to a lot of the conflicts in the region anyway. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, I think this is a really important test case, as I said, because it speaks for whether they live up to their ideals. When I look at Ajami, I don't only think of him, I think of someone like Hamza Kashkari in Saudi Arabia, rotting in a dungeon for almost a year now.
But of course, Al Jazeera English, perhaps not the Arabic as much, but Al Jazeera English did cover Hamza al-Kashkari, correct?
Well, it's because we were there. No, I'm kidding. But I mean, I think it's been good. There have been encouraging signs, particularly from Al Jazeera English. There are some stellar journalists within Al Jazeera who try to push the envelope. From time to time, they do get away with criticizing Gulf countries, particularly the actions of the likes of Saudi Arabia. I still think with Qatar, it's a great taboo. I think our ex-colleagues across the road at Al Jazeera Arabic recognized much earlier than those at English that you can cover the rest of the world, just don't cover Qatar.
Well, to that point, Imran, I'm going to interrupt you because we actually have a comment that's addressing this exact thing. Salam al-Qasimi saying AJE and AJA, the Arabic, are very different. Sometimes Al Jazeera English says one thing on an issue and Al Jazeera Arabic says something completely different. It's confusing, dysfunctional, probably. Could you just explain and extrapolate the significance in terms of freedom of speech between Al Jazeera English and Al Jazeera Arabic and the editorial process?
It's an interesting, it is an interesting question because a lot of the time it is down to dysfunctionality. They are two very separate channels. A lot of the people at Al Jazeera English don't understand Arabic, joined Al Jazeera. They created their very own Al Jazeera when they joined it based on their ideals. Within Al Jazeera Arabic, there are others who see English as having nothing to do with them. I agree absolutely that there isn't the synergy and harmony editorially, for better or for worse, wherever you stand on a sort of political issue. But I think what's terribly important as well is that this is an example of geopolitics at play. When we look at these poets, whether in Qatar or in Saudi Arabia, the fact that Ai Weiwei is in the consciousness of the world, the fact that you have Iranian dissidents, North Korean dissidents, etc., that the State Department tells you about, that all global mainstream media tells you about, suggests a certain consistency in geopolitics and good guys and bad guys. So when the Iranians or the Chinese do it and they jail people for just speaking their minds or writing a poem, for God's sake, people are upset about it. However, when it comes to the United States allies in the region, particularly the likes of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, there's a deafening silence, which is why I think segments such as this one are really important.
Imran, to your point, I want to kind of ask Amber her thoughts on this, because Amber, I know you've reported from other countries and you travel often in the Arab world, and I'm sure you've come across the notion that many people, as much as the Emir in that CBS interview later on says that the people love Al Jazeera, maybe the leaders don't love Al Jazeera because they're airing sometimes their dirty laundry and corruption and so on and so forth. Do you think this is sustainable for Qatar? I mean, it seems they're invincible. There really haven't been large protests in Qatar. There have been in Bahrain, even in Saudi Arabia. Do you think this is a sustainable model? And do you think that they can continue to report on other countries without reporting on their own grievances and problems?
No, I think it's going to come back and bite them in the rear. You can't operate like this. You can't take with the left and give with the right. And in the end, if they're not going to criticize Qatar, but criticize every other country, you almost kind of wonder why Al Jazeera was founded in the first place, because it was founded by Sheikh Ahmad, who was criticized by the poet who's now in solitary confinement. And you almost wonder if from the get-go, this network was created to kind of point the finger at everyone else and really raise awareness about all the happening in every other country, but oh no, don't look at Qatar. Nothing bad's happening here. Turn away and focus on Tunisia, and we're starting to see that happen now, and the public starting to become more and more aware. Hence this conversation we're having today, and they're starting to lose credibility, and that's a shame because there are some fantastic journalists at Al Jazeera who really value that credibility.
Omar, hearing what Amber has to say, I mean, I know, we used to work together at Al Jazeera, and I know you're still in Doha, and you have a pulse on what's happening. I mean, she's, I think, questioning what the motivation was to launching Al Jazeera. What is your thoughts on that?
I wasn't around when Al Jazeera was launched, so I couldn't say exactly what the Emir's motivation was.
But having worked there, you
over the BBC's channel.
Having worked there, you clearly had a sense of why you were there, because a lot of people point to the fact that everyone who joins Al Jazeera kind of has their own idea about, maybe they're idealistic, maybe they're trying to change the region. I mean, many Al Jazeera Arabic reporters and hosts themselves say that this is about trying to change the region for the better through the democratic process.
For sure. You, myself, Garda, we all worked at AJE. Al Jazeera English was this new channel that was starting up. Everybody came in. They said, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to offer the voice of the South. We're going to try to change the news paradigm. And I think that's probably what AJA was founded on as well, the Arabic channel. I think in many ways, to call out Al Jazeera's hypocrisy right now is being much too harsh on it. Al Jazeera is far from perfect. In many ways, it can be unprofessional, as we know because we work there, and we know that things are very inconsistently enforced throughout. But at the same time, there's problems with every news organization, whether it be the New York Times and their coverage.
Of course, and there's bias.
Conflict.
Yeah, and there's bias and hypocrisy almost at every news organization. But I think not many news organizations are funded by a government per se. Imran, go ahead.
Yeah, I think to back up what Omar is saying here, I feel that from my personal perspective, again, to qualify, there's some tremendous journalists doing incredible work at Al Jazeera. I think what we're seeing is a symptom of Al Jazeera being just like the other networks, and I think that is disheartening, disquieting for so many people.
Imran?
We thought that we could get away with it being maybe greater than that. And the reason I say that is because, for example, when you watch RT, Ahmed, you know they're going to give you great coverage of Occupy Wall Street, for example, but they're not going to tell you of, say, Russian forces killing Chechens in Grozny or Dagestan, and you accept that. In the same way you watch Press TV and you know that they're not going to be hard on Iran, but they're going to throw mud at the United States or the Europeans, etc. So in that sense, I feel that Al Jazeera has unfortunately shown us a symptom of that, with the fact that, those who pay the piper decide the tune, and those who are employees of this organization, sometimes it's merely self-censorship. They feel, not on my watch, I don't want to be the one criticizing those who pay my salary, so I'm going to stay away from this story this story might be a little sacrifice for us to maybe do greater work. So I think what we're seeing is just a symptom of it being a mainstream news network like many others, when many expected it to be better. And in the cold, harsh light of day, I ask myself, how could we expect it to be any better than that? Because there's quid pro quo in everything in life.
Well, Imran, to that point, I mean, you know, I watch Al Jazeera all the time. We have many colleagues who still work there, and that's the reason I wanted to do this segment. Because, you know, when I do watch their coverage of Syria, for example, it's hard to ignore the fact that Al Jazeera, you know, or not Al Jazeera, I should say, Qatar, which funds Al Jazeera, is also funding many of these rebel groups and providing weapons, and is very involved, you know, as it should be, you know, in the region, in the diplomatic and political transformation of the region. So then it does beg the question then, Amber, where that motivation is, which is the question that you had brought up. I don't want to focus entirely on Al Jazeera. I want to talk about this poet as well, because he is, after all, what sparked this conversation. I mean, you know, Omar said, perhaps rightfully, that many believe he's going to be pardoned. Do you think it matters whether he is or isn't pardoned? Obviously, for him it matters, but in the context of Al Jazeera's reputation and Qatar's reputation, does it matter?
I think the damage is already done because they haven't accurately covered the story. And bottom line, black and white, there's a poet, a talented poet, sitting in solitary confinement almost a year for what? 1 or 2 lines of poetry criticizing oppressive Arab regimes. I mean, that alone tells you about the human rights record of Qatar, and also the fact that Al Jazeera is willing to cover these situations in other countries, but not adequately cover them in Qatar, tells you, it speaks volumes about the current credibility of coverage in this country. And it's a shame. And in the end, the poet loses out, and the viewers lose out as well, because viewers don't have time to go and pick and choose what network is telling what story accurately and which one isn't. We as journalists are more keen to that. But in the end, the viewers are the ones being defrauded.
Well, that's certainly true. But Amber, as journalists, aren't we also inherently biased, all of us?
Of course, I say I'm biased all the time, but I'm biased toward the truth. And it's ridiculous that a poet is sitting in jail in solitary confinement for over a year. So I'm biased to say as a journalist that this is crazy and he should be released.
Omar, do you have any sense of what it was specifically that actually brought upon these charges for the poet? I mean, we have certain lines like, "We are all Tunisia in the face of the repressive elite." We also have a line about sheikhs playing on their PlayStations, which was included in the poem. I mean, these don't seem like inherently, you know, aggressive criticisms of the Emir. It's not as though he was inciting per se specifically that people should overthrow the Emir of Qatar, did he?
Right. So the notion that's been conveyed to me is that it's not about this Tunisian Jasmine poem that he was arrested and confined. Obviously, his Tunisia Jasmine poem was in 2011, and he was arrested in November 2011. But what I've heard a few times now is that it was about the poetry duels that he was carrying out in Cairo in 2010, that were held in private gatherings, whether they be parties or meetings, what have you, that he was having with another Qatari poet, where he would say various things that were, in theory, I haven't heard them myself, so I can't say for sure. I'm not a native Arabic speaker, and it's done in a Qatari Bedouin dialect. So I can't confirm it yet, but the point is that they're saying that he's saying all these deriding things, not necessarily on TV when he's doing the poems on TV. He's being very flowery and praiseworthy on TV.
Right.
But in private, he's saying these insulting things. And obviously using innuendo as well, not directly naming people either.
Ahmed.
So,
yes, Imran, I want to come to you. Finish your point. Omar, go ahead.
Yeah, so the notion is it's not that he's been studying in Cairo. So the notion is that when he came back to Qatar, that's when he was arrested, not because of the Tunisia Jasmine poem, but because he was out of the country while he was making these allegedly insulting poems.
Imran, I know you have something you want to share with us, but I do want to quickly ask you, when it comes to inciting revolts and so on and so forth, many have said Al Jazeera Arabic and their anchors and reporters have actually not incited a revolt, but encouraged protesters to protest and kind of sided with protesters against authoritarian regimes across the region. Assuming that that's true, doesn't that then mean that Al Jazeera is inciting essentially protest movements in the region? I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. Just break it down for us.
Well, to answer your question, there are some things that disturb me, particularly from Al Jazeera Arabic. For example, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi in his show calling for any youth who might come across Muammar Gaddafi to kill him. And that came to fruition a couple of months later. That was undoubtedly somebody calling for the death of a head of state, whether you like him or not. And perhaps he needs to be, held to account for that. So, incitement, yes, absolutely. In that show, 100%. To go back to the point I wanted to make when Omar was talking, even if he was talking for the overthrow of the Emir, even if he was saying we need to get rid of him and we need somebody else, that doesn't justify him being held in solitary confinement for a year. Qatar is a signatory to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And may I remind everybody that the Emir deposed his father in a coup. So we're not talking about a democratically elected leader here. So even if he said the nastiest stuff with the worst four-letter words in Arabic or English, that doesn't justify his treatment.
Shireen, I want to give you the last word. I know you're Iranian American. I know you're familiar with Press TV, and I know you're also familiar with Al Jazeera. Now, obviously, very different networks, but Al Jazeera or Qatar, they're not the only ones who have a government-funded news network that might be vying for influence in the region or in the world. So, what are your lasting thoughts on Al Jazeera's credibility and moving forward? What do you anticipate? Do you watch Al Jazeera English? Do you rely on Al Jazeera for news?
No, I don't. I rely on all sorts of news media for my information. I do want to point out that when I worked at Al Jazeera, we had a report that we wanted to do on a transgender television host in Pakistan. And we put everything together. We contacted the person, and it was a fascinating story. And we were told to kill it. This is for Al Jazeera English, because this type of story is sensitive for Qatari culture. So I think when we're talking about news bias, if you want to, I think you're trying to maybe refer to Press TV. I would include the BBC in there, which is a state-funded media. All of these different state-funded media have they have biases. The difference is when they declare those biases, or when those biases are obvious enough to their consumers of news. And I don't think that is the case very much in Al Jazeera, certainly not when it's viewed from the West by people who are sick and tired of something like, I don't know, CNN or something.
Well, Shireen, I appreciate you making that anecdote. It's actually very salient. It's a point that isn't often too made. But Imran, on that point, I'll leave the last comment with you, because I'll be honest with you, man, I've never been told while working at Al Jazeera that I can't do a specific story. Maybe I was lucky, but I never saw that. I feel like journalists really work and report freely for Al Jazeera largely. I don't know, maybe that's just my take. What's your take, very quickly? You've worked there much longer than me. Ever told you can't do a story?
I still think it's the best game in town in terms of international news, which you can read into however you wish. I did have one story pulled once, which was, interestingly, on migrant laborers in Qatar in 2007. It was about to be aired in a news hour, and there was a managerial meeting, and they pulled it. And I'll leave you with this. One of the reasons for it being pulled was that one of the managers said, I'm not so sure if we are allowed to interview somebody who's on the run, because I'd interviewed this guy who was on the run from Qatari authorities. And I said, you do realize that we run Osama bin Laden tapes, and at this very moment, we are running a promo which says, Laurent Nkunda, Africa's most wanted, talks to Al Jazeera. Suffice to say that didn't get me anywhere, and they pulled it anyway. But I still think it's the best game in town. Among a bad bunch.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Amber, thank you so much for joining us. Imran, Omar, and Shireen as well.
Thanks,
and just for the record, because here at HuffPost Live, this transparency and accountability really matter. The motivation to doing this story was not to try and expose Al Jazeera or to grind an axe or any of that nature. I just really do believe in Al Jazeera's mission, which is to share underreported stories and give voice to the voiceless. And even though he's a poet, I think he's pretty voiceless right now in solitary confinement. So that's the motivation for this segment. Thanks for watching. Much more coming up, as always, at HuffPost Live.